everyone, I'm Shreya. I'm here to talk about Azure Functions using Python. I'm a product manager at Microsoft and I've worked there for a couple years now. And I'm on the Azure Functions team, specifically working in the Python sector. So today I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about serverless and what serverless is in case you're just getting started. And then I'll go into Azure Functions and kind of what Azure Functions has to offer, how you can quickly set up and get started today. And then I'll go into some new features that we're releasing in the coming week, including HTTP streaming support and SDK type bindings for Azure Storage and Blob. Awesome. So to start off with, what is serverless? Some of the benefits of serverless are that it really allows you to focus on your code and forget the distractions that come with server management, right? So things like capacity planning or availability planning, those things are no longer necessary because you'll be working with a serverless technology. Also with serverless, there's the ability to have event-driven applications. So events can actually trigger applications in almost real time, and there's almost no limit for scalability as well. So compute resources can be really used as needed, which is also a great offering of serverless. The other great thing with scalability also comes with just paying for what you use. So basically, when you're using serverless technologies, many times you don't have to worry about betting the farm on day one. You're really able to start off incrementally and see how much is it that you want to invest in, how much do you want to try out for. So that's also a really great offering of serverless. And then some additional benefits include the ability to solve business problems, not technology problems. Like I mentioned before, you don't really have to worry about a lot of server issues that come up. You're just worrying about your business logic, what you have to accomplish. There's also a shorter time to market. So because we're able to develop quicker and not worry about those overhead costs, you're having a shorter time to deliver what you're creating. This also makes it easier to fail fast, get started quicker, all of those things. So it is a much more simplified starting experience, like you'll see in my demo of Azure Functions as well. So now that I talked a little bit about serverless, I want to go into Azure Functions and really what the service offers you. So Azure Functions is an event-driven service, and it provides compute on demand, and it enables code and logic to run when triggered by events. It's a service as a service. So like I mentioned before, with most serverless technologies, you're able to set up and get started in just a few minutes. Also, you just have to focus on deploying that code, and the rest is really going to be managed for you. Observability and monitoring are available out of the box, so you don't really need to worry about setting those things up on your own. It's very, very easy to integrate that into your function. You can essentially trigger your function on dozens of event resources like Event Hub, HTTP, and much more. And Azure Functions is built for both developers and for enterprises. We're also open source, so if you have the chance, check out our GitHub repository. We love interacting with you all and getting suggestions, and we would love for you to take a look into our code as well and just explore that. So next, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the programming model itself. So the core functionality of Azure Functions, how you would go out to develop that. So first, I'd like to call out that within an Azure function, you can have many different functions. So there's a function app, which is synonymously called a project as well. And within that, you'll have many different functions. So this is the programming model or the architecture for just a singular function, which again, there can be many of within the app. So we have four main components here. We have the trigger, the input binding, the output binding, and then also your business logic, your code. So the trigger is going to be required for every function, and it's essentially going to invoke the function. It's going to start the code and make it run. So a trigger can be many different things. It can be, like, if you want to keep it really simple, it can be an HTTP request. It can be a timer, so it just runs on a schedule. But we can also invoke on things like databases. So a trigger basically just causes your function to run, and without it, you won't have an Azure function. So it's really important. It's the most important part, I would say. Then the input and output bindings are completely optional. They're if you want to use data from other resources or input data into other resources. So in this example, I have an input binding, which is a Cosmos database, and then the output binding is a CSV or a JSON file. So we have many different input and output bindings that you can choose from, even the ability to customize them. But those are completely optional, and it's going to depend on the logic of your code and what you're hoping to accomplish with your Azure function. And the last component is your code, like I mentioned. So that's going to be whatever you want to do using that function. Next, I'm going to go into a couple of common use cases for Azure Functions that we've seen, and then I'm going to go into some demos. So one use case that comes to mind is with this database. So we have a SQL database here, and the customer or the developer, their goal is to make sure that they can send emails to the customers in the database, and they want to make sure that they're not sending multiple emails to the same customer. So in order to keep that business going and making sure that they can do that effectively, they're using a function to deduplicate the database. So they're using the SQL database as both an input and an output binding, and the trigger of this function is actually going to be a timer or a schedule because it runs every 15 minutes. The next example that I want to share with you all is also pretty common that we see, and maybe it's something that you'd like to use as well. We have an app or device that's producing a lot of data, and ultimately we want to be able to visualize that data and make sure that we can see, how is this app performing, dig a little bit deeper into the telemetry, for instance. And to do that, we're actually having an event hub that's ingesting this telemetry data from the app. Right? And when we have that event hub, we're going to use it as a trigger for our Azure function. And the Azure function will actually take the data, whatever is relevant based on the business logic that we've defined, and put that in a Cosmos database. So in this case, the trigger is the event hub, and the output binding is the Cosmos database where we're storing the data. And then ultimately, we can actually use that database to have a dashboard and visualize all of that telemetry that we had wanted to see in the first place. So as you can see here, an Azure function can be easily integrated and very beneficial if you have a longer workflow like this or something simple like wanting to deduplicate a database. Awesome, so I hope that gives you all a little bit of context on when you might use Azure Functions, what are some common scenarios, and so on. But now I really want to talk about Azure Functions and the Python programming model specifically. So earlier I referred to the programming model as this entity with a trigger and input and output bindings and your code. And when I use the word programming model in this context, I'm actually just talking about how you would write that code. So how would you really get started with Python in Azure Functions? So just give me a moment because I'm going to share a new tab really quickly. Awesome. So to get started here, all you would have to do is download the Azure Functions VS Code extension, and then you can go ahead and open up the command palette. Great. So I'm going to say create new project, which, like I mentioned earlier, is synonymous to a function app. And then I'm going to go ahead and use Python, but as you can see, we have many other languages that you can use as well. And then, like I mentioned before, I'm going to use a different programming model based on my circumstances. So we recommend that all of our customers use the V2 programming model. So if you're a new customer, or even if you're making a new function app, but an existing customer, the V2 programming model is much more Pythonic. We were getting a lot of feedback from customers that the Azure Functions programming model wasn't quite as easy to get started with if you are using Python. So that's kind of why we went and developed this newer programming model. And one of the main differences is that triggers and bindings are represented as decorators, which is very similar to how you would develop in Python, as you all know. So I would go ahead and select the V2 programming model. I'm gonna go ahead. And for now, I'm going to just do an HTTP trigger since I'm kind of just showing you all like a hello world scenario. But as you can see, there's many templates here to select from, and there's even more triggers that you can discover in our documentation. Awesome. So as you can see here, I have a function that's popped up. So this is really easy to get started. It just took me a couple minutes, and all I needed to do was download that Azure Visual Studio Azure Functions extension, and then also core tools, but you can find that all in the getting started page that I'll share at the end. But as you can see here, we have the template set up for a function, and we even have documentation within the IDE. So many times, when you're using a new technology, you have to go and refer to the documentation. But one of the great things about functions that we've improved on over the years is having this available to you right off the bat. So without really going anywhere, you can access information about how to get started. So I'm going to cross this out. Then I'm going to go ahead and start the function. So we have the URL populated. Awesome. And then as you can see, the function ran successfully. So the code was pretty simple. It's just saying hello to the name that you passed through. Amazing. So yay. Okay, that's a basic hello world case. So now that I kind of showed you all how you can get started if you don't have an existing app or you just want to try it out, I also want to share a case of if you have like a WSGI or ASGI app already, so a fast API or like a Flask app, and you want to bring it over to functions. It's actually really simple to do that as well. Okay, so here I have a Flask app, and it's a very simple app. It's just a Hello World app right here. So very, very simple. But now I'm going to bring it over to functions. And in order to do that, all I have to do is first make sure that the area that the app is stored is the same within my function folder that was created. So just bringing that over. And then I have to make a few additional changes to to my host.json, where I'm adding in the extension and the root prefix. So with those changes, all I have to do is go into my function app file and add this one line of code that is a wrapper around the Flask app. So here I've just added this one line of code. As you can see, all it contains is the Flask app. Then go ahead and start the app. And okay, awesome. So we got our URL. Great, so as you can see, it prints out Hello World, so we were able to wrap that app, and this works for generally any Flask or Fast API app that you might have. So if you're interested in just bringing your apps on over, know it's really easy, especially with the newer programming model that we offer. Okay, great. So now that I was able to kind of get you all started and how you would use Azure Functions if you haven't used it already or if you have a Fast API or Flask app, I also want to talk about some newer features that we're releasing soon. So next week is our Microsoft Build conference. So if you do have time or a chance, I would highly recommend tuning in to some of the sessions online. But the reason I'm actually talking about this is because these features are coming out next week. So I'm just going to kind of give you all a sneak peek, a preview into what these features do, because they're both very specific to Python. As I mentioned earlier, the features are HTTP streaming support and SDK type bindings. But we also have a lot of other exciting stuff coming out in Build for functions, specifically even for Python. We have a new OpenAI extension coming out that's going to make it even easier to use OpenAI in your functions. So would highly recommend checking that out if you have the chance. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and talk about those two features. So HTTP streaming support will now be in preview for Azure Functions. So HTTP streaming is basically that mechanism of transferring data over HTTP as efficiently as possible. So that's what this feature will offer. It's going to let you process that data as soon as you receive it. So that's going to make a really big difference if you're trying to have a scenario that uses real-time streaming or something of that matter. Also, it makes it a lot easier for you to scale up and handle larger data sets. So with HTTP streaming, there's a lot more capacity to handle larger data sets without excessive memory or processing resources required. So that's really a game changer. Also, I want to call out that previously with HTTP requests in Azure Functions, the amount of data that could be transmitted was limited, but now a lot more data can be streamed with chunking. So this does empower you to have it empowers different scenarios. If you're already using functions, you might not have thought to use it for something that's more like real-time streaming with HTTP, but now that is something you can do. And as a bonus, for this feature, we'll also support fast API response types. So you might be thinking, okay, like what are some scenarios that I can use HTTP streaming for? And basically anything that requires like a low latency and a high throughput, that would be a great case for this. So this includes things like large file uploads and downloads, things like real-time streaming or OpenAI streaming, also multimedia streaming. So I will give an example of this actually later onwards. But yeah, these are all really good scenarios for when you would use HTTP streaming. So, okay, the first demo I want to give you all, this is comparing the current HTTP experience, so without HTTP streaming, to if you were using HTTP streaming. So you're going to see in this demo that, first of all, it's going to be faster to use streaming. It's going to be quicker. Also, you're going to see that we're streaming from OpenAI, so we're getting like a large data set. And while we're doing that, with streaming, you're going to get that data incrementally, whereas without it, you're going to get it all in one. So I'm going to go ahead and play this demo. Okay. So as you can see here, this is the function, and it's connecting to Azure API. Both of the functions do exactly the same thing, but one uses HTTP as we have it today, and the other uses HTTP streaming. And in this case, I'm just asking the function to grab 100 cities, like 100 most populous cities from Azure OpenAI, essentially. So forward this. Okay, so as you can see, it took a couple seconds, but we got it. So this is the first function with HTTP requests as we have them today. And then we're loading the function in the browser. And you can see all of the cities arrived at once, right? We got that whole list at once, and it took a few seconds. Maybe that's not the best user experience. But yeah, now we're going to run the next function that does use HTTP streaming. As you can see, the function does exactly the same thing. Just uses Azure OpenAI. Okay, so running the function, we'll first see how long it took. So it takes a little bit less time comparing. But as you know, this is a smaller data set, so the difference will be a lot more when when processing a lot more data as well. But yeah, as you can see, it took fewer seconds to complete. And now when we actually load the data in the browser, you'll see that it's coming incrementally. So this is kind of the power of HTTP streaming, right? This enables a lot more scenarios, especially as we're looking to use more AI in our applications. Awesome, so I'm gonna go to the next slide. So the next feature I want to talk to you all about is SDK type bindings for Azure Blob storage. This feature will also be in preview next week. And SDK type bindings refers back to that concept I shared earlier of triggers and bindings and functions, where bindings are optional, but they're an ability to connect with different sources of data, right? When we enable SDK type bindings, we actually input more capabilities into those original bindings. So even though bindings will handle a lot of the more popular cases when it comes to using Azure Functions, sometimes we see customers going directly to the SDK to accomplish certain scenarios. But with this feature, the SDK capabilities will all be lit up within Azure Functions itself, so making it even easier. And this feature was really highly requested by customers, specifically for Azure Blob storage. So for now, that's all we've enabled. But I think it's going to make a really big difference and allow customers to do certain things they weren't able to before with functions. So yes, like I kind of explained, it's going to improve the triggers and bindings experience because it's going to give more power and ability and what you can do with functions without going to the SDK itself. Some of the scenarios it's going to enable include, again, downloading and uploading larger blobs of larger sizes. So again, this can be very helpful as we think into more OpenAI or AI-centric scenarios in general. It's also going to improve performance when you are using blobs, especially larger ones. And it's going to eliminate that workaround that customers are currently having to go through to do certain actions. They're able to do them much easier with this feature being released. Awesome, so now I'm going to actually demo a larger experience that uses both SDK type bindings and HTTP streaming. What we're gonna do here is take a file that we have locally. It's called painting.mp4, it's a video file. And we're gonna have that be in the Azure Storage blob and then pull that with HTTP streaming and actually display it to the user. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you all. So as you can see, we have these two functions. The first one actually will go upload the file to the blob, and the next one is going to pull that same, sorry, not function, it's going to pull the video from the blob actually. Let's see. Where is my mouse? Cool, and then we also have this other function. It's not a function, it's just a file that simulates a post request. So we can confirm, we can upload the file to the blob in the first place. Okay, so as you can see here, we're just running the function, and this is to upload the file. So we're uploading the file. Oops. In the file, and as you can see, it doesn't exist yet in the blob. But we've uploaded it and it's going incrementally as well, so we're using HTTP streaming for this. Able to upload the blob as expected, or upload the file as expected, as it does show up here in the blob. Then we're just running the next function now in order to make sure that we can actually pull that video back and see it locally. So we're going to use the VLC media player and just open up that file. It takes a couple seconds sometimes, just because it's a little bit of a larger file. But yes, now we have the file locally playing. So hopefully that kind of gives you a taste of what you can do with these two new features, SDK type bindings for Azure Storage Blob and HTTP streaming. If you'd like to learn more, please do tune in for Build. We'll be releasing more information about these features. I also have a link for you all here. Sorry, guys. Yeah. Cool. I have this link for you all. It's gonna have, it's gonna upload more information about these features as we release them. But for now, it's a great placeholder. So do check it out in the coming week, even if you aren't able to tune in at Build. And please follow us on Azure Functions on Twitter or X. And then also, if you want some tips or tricks, we have a more informal account that posts called Azure Functions Python. And if you'd like to stay in touch with me, this is my information on my link tree. So feel free to add me on LinkedIn or something like that. But yeah, thank you guys for joining and for listening along. Awesome.